suppose this one is slightly awkward that I decided to do a second series of ads. Okay. If anyone's here, I do not know why it ran 2 sets of ads. But it ran 2 sets of ads. I've turned off the majority of the ads in my chat. I will just post the thing for September and my computer build one, so. But tonight we are doing more of Fearsome Fairies. And maybe we might get more than one story tonight. Last week, it was a very long story. And I'm trying to listen to see how well I can hear whether or not I'm cutting out or not. So, I've got the microphone hanging down like less than a foot away from my mouth. So, hopefully it won't pick up the background noise nearly as much. It's not showing that it's getting a lot of it. It's keeping me somewhat in the higher green and into the yellow, so my regular speaking voice should preferably be hearable. But enough with the techno babble. I'll try to re-record yesterday's stream and post it. But for now, let's get into tonight's wonderful stories. Back to the haunted woods we go. Hey, Guilty. Why are you looking afoot? And congrats on getting first. Why aren't I what? Licking feet? Because I cannot reach mine. It has been a very long time since I've been able to get my foot anywhere near my mouth. Yes, I've joined the ghosts of the scene. Stretch. Already stretched. I'll stretch again. Is YouTube Studio already acting up? Or is it just delayed? Yeah, it's delayed. Yeah. Let's see, I didn't look to see which one. Oh, the closed room. Oh, interesting. This next one was actually written by the same person who did Little Lord Fauntleroy. Dooby-dooby-doo. Did she also do the previous story? Yeah. Nope, different person. Okay. Well, since everything is sounding nice and crisp, I hope. I keep trying to turn my fan away from my face, but one of them has a natural thing about tilting itself up. But we try what we can. So the first story I'm going to try tonight is from 1904 by the author Frances Hodgson Burnett. And that story is In the Closed Room. In the fierce, airless heat of the small square room, the child Judith panted as she lay on her bed. Her father and mother slept near her, drowned in by the heavy slumber of workers after their day's labor. Some people in the next flat were quarreling, irritated probably because of the appalling heat, and their miserable helplessness against it. All the hot emanations of the sun-baked city streets seemed to combine with their clamor and unrest, and rise to the flat in which the child lay gazing at the darkness. It was situated but a few feet from the track of the elevated railroad, and existence seemed to pulsate to the rush and the roar of the demon which swept past the windows every few minutes. No one knew that Judith held the thing in horror, but it was the truth that she did. She was only 7 years old. At that age, it was not easy to explain oneself to the older people so they could understand. She could only have said, "I hate it. It comes so fast. It is always coming. It makes a sound as if thunder were quite close. I can never get away from it." The children in the other flats rather liked it, then hung out the window perilously to watch it thunder past and to see people who crowded it pressed close together in the seats, standing in the aisles, hanging on to the straps. Sometimes in the evening there were people who were going to the theater, and the women and girls were dressed in light colors and wore hats covered with white feathers and flowers. At such times the children were delighted, and Judith used to hear the three of the next flat calling out to each other, "That's my lady! That's my lady! That one's mine!" And that's what she said. Judith was not like the children in the other flats. She was a frail, curious creature with silent ways and a soft voice and eyes. She liked to play by herself in the corner of the room, and to talk to herself as she played. No one knew what she talked about. In fact, no one quite inquired. Her mother was always too busy. When she was not making men's coats by the score at the whizzing sewing machine, she was hurriedly pressing and preparing a meal which was always in danger of being late. There was the breakfast, which might not be ready in time for her husband to reach his shop when the whistle blows. And there was supper, which might not be in time to be waiting for him when he returned in the evening. The midday meal was a trifling matter, needing no special preparation. One ate anything one could find left from supper or breakfast. Judith's relation to her father and mother was not a very intimate one. They were too hard worked to have time for domestic intimacies, and features of the acquaintance that was neither of them was sufficiently articulate to find expression for that fact. The young man and woman felt the child vaguely remote. Their affection for her was tinged with something indefinitely like reverence. She had been a lovely baby with a peculiar magnolia whiteness of skin and very large, sweetly smiling eyes of dark blue, fringed with quite black lashes. She had exquisite pointed fingers and slender feet, and though Mr. and Mrs. Foster were, perhaps fortunately, unaware of it, she had not been the baby one would have expected to come in life in the corner of a hive of a workman's flat a few feet from the elevated railroad. "Sometimes it seems as if she couldn't be mine," Mrs. Foster had said at times. She ain't like me. She ain't like Jim Foster, Lord knows. She ain't like none of the either of the families I have ever heard of, excepting it might be her Aunt Hester, for she died long before I was born. I've only heard Mother tell about her. She was awfully pretty girl. Mother said that she had skin of lily-white complexion and long, slender fingers, and it was so supple she could curl 'em back like they was double-jointed. Her eyes was big and had eyelashes that stood out around 'em, but they were all brown. Mother said she wasn't like any other kind of girl. She thinks Judith may turn out like her. She wasn't but 15 when she died. She never was ill in her life, but one morning she didn't come down for breakfast. And when they went up to call her, she was there sitting in her window, resting her chin in her hand, with her face turned up, smiling as if she was talking with someone. The doctor said it happened before a few hours, and then she'd come to the window to look at the stars. Easy way to go, wasn't it? Judith had heard of her Aunt Hester, but she knew only that she herself had hands like her and that her life ended when she was quite young. Mrs. Foster was much too occupied by the strenuous life to dwell upon the passing of souls. To her, the girl Hester seemed too remote to appear quite real. The legends of her beauty and unlikeliness of the other girls seemed rather like a sort of romance. She was not aware that Judith hated the elevated railroad, so she was not aware that she was fond of the faraway Aunt Hester with the long pointed fingers which could curl round backwards. She did not show that when she was playing in the corner of the room, where it was her way to sit in her little chair with her face turned towards the wall, she often sat curling her long fingers backwards and talking to herself about Aunt Hester. But this, as well as many other things, was true. It was not secretiveness which caused the child to refrain from speaking of certain things. She herself could not have explained the reasons for her silence. Also, it had never occurred to her that the explanation and reasons were necessary. Her mental attitude was that of a child who, knowing a certain language, does not speak it to those who have never heard, or are wholly ignorant of it. She knew her Aunt Hester as her mother did not. She had seen her often in her dreams and had a secret fancy that she could dream of her when she wished to do so. She was very fond of dreaming of her. The places where she came upon Aunt Hester were strange and lovely places where the air one breathed smelled like flowers, and everything was lovely in a new way. And when one moved, one felt so light that movement was delightful. And when wakened, one had not quite got over the lightness, and for a few moments felt as if one could float out of bed. The healthy, vigorous young couple who were the child's parents were in a healthy, earthly way very fond of each other. They had made genuine love match and had found it satisfactory. The young mechanic, Jim Foster, had met the young shopgirl, Jane Hardy, at Coney Island one summer night and had become at once enamored with her shopgirl looks and her high spirits. They had married as soon as Jim had had the raise he was anticipating, and had from the time lived with such harmony in the flat building by the elevated train rushed by and roared every few minutes through the day and the greater part of the night. They themselves did not object to the elevated. Jim was habituated to uproar in the machine shop in which he spent his days, and Jane was too much absorbed in making men's coats by the dozens to observe anything else. The pair had healthy appetites and slept well after the day's work, a hearty supper, long cheerful talk, and loud laughter over simple, common joking. "She's a queer little fish, Judy," Jane said to her husband as they sat by the open window one night. Jim's arm curled comfortably around the young woman's waist as he smoked his pipe. "What do you think she says to me after I put her to bed?" "Search me," said Jane jocularly. Jane laughed. "Why," she says, "I wish the elevated train would stop." "Why?" says I. "I want to go to sleep," she says. "I'm going to dream of Aunt Hester." "What does she know about her Aunt Hester?" said Jim. "Who's been talking to her?" "Not me," Jane said. "She doesn't know nothing but what she's picked up by chance. I don't believe in talking to young ones about dead folks. 'Tain't healthy." "Well, that's right," said Jim. "Children's that's got the hustle about the among the live folk for a living best to keep their minds out of the cemeteries. But, oh gee, what a queer thing for a young one to say. And that ain't all, Jane went on, her giggle half amused, half nervous. But I don't fall asleep when I see Aunt Hester, she says. I fall awake. It's more awake there than here. Where, says I, laughing a bit, though it did make me feel quite queer. I don't know, she says in her soft little voice of hers. There, and not another thing could I get out of her. On the hot night through whose first hours Judith lay panting in her corner of her room, tormented and kept awake by the constant roar and rush and the flash of lights. She was trying to go to sleep in the hope of leaving all the heat and noise and discomfort behind and reaching Aunt Hester. If she could fall awake, she would feel and hear none of it. It would all be unreal, and she would know that only the lightness of the air like flowers and the lovely brightness were true. Once, as she tossed her on her bed-cot, she broke into a low little laugh to think how untrue things really were and how strange it was that people did not understand, that even she felt as she lay in the darkness that she could not get away. And she could not get away unless the train would just stop long enough to let her fall asleep. If she could fall asleep between the trains, she would not awaken. But they came so quickly, one after the other. Her hair was damp, and she pushed it from her forehead. The bed felt hot against her skin. The people in the next flat quarreled more angrily. Judith heard a loud slap, and then the woman began to cry. She was a young married woman, scarcely more than a girl. Her marriage had not been as successful as that of Judith's parents. Both husband and wife had terrible tempers. Through the thin wall, Judith could hear the girl sobbing angrily as the man flung himself out of bed, put on his clothes, and went out, banging the door after him. She doesn't know, said the child, whispering eerily, that it isn't real at all. There was in her strange little soul a secret no one knew the existence of. It was a vague belief that she herself was not quite real, or that she did not belong to the life she had been born into. Her mother and father loved her, and she loved them, but sometimes she was on the brink of telling them that she could not stay long, that some mistake had been made. What mistake? Or where she was to go if she went, she did not know. She used to catch her breath and stop herself and feel frightened when she had been near speaking of this fantastic thing. But the building full of workmen's flats, the hot room, the elevated railroad, the quarrying people were all just a mistake. Just once or twice in her life she had seen places and things which did not seem so foreign. Once, when she had taken to the park in the spring, she had wandered away from her mother into a sequestered place among shrubs and trees, all waving tender, pale new green, with the leaves a few early hot days had caused to rush out and tremble furled. There had been a stillness there, and the scents and colors she knew. A bird had come and swung upon a twig quite near her, and, looking at her with bright, soft, full eyes, had sung gently to her, as if he were speaking. A squirrel had crept into her lap and had not moved when she stroked it. Its eyes had been full and soft also, and she knew it understood that she could not hurt it. There was no mistake in being among the new fair greenness, and the woodland things who spoke to her. They did not use words, but no words were needed. She knew what they were saying. When she had pushed her way through the greenness of the shrubbery to the driveway, she had found herself quite near an open carriage, which had stopped because the lady who sat in it was speaking to a friend on the path. She was a young woman dressed in delicate spring colors, and the little girl at her side was dressed in white cloth, and it was just the little girl Judith found herself gazing at. Under her large white hat and the feathers, her little face seemed like a white flower. She had a deep dimple near her mouth. Her hair was a rich coppery red and hung heavy along the sides of her cheeks and shoulders. She lifted her head a little when the child in the common hat and frock pressed through the grayness of the bushes, and she looked at Judith just as a bird and the squirrel had looked at her. They gazed as if they had known each other for ages of years and were separated by nothing. Each of them was quite happy at being near the other, and there was not in the mind of either the question nor of their being near each other ever again. The question did not rise in Judith's mind even when in a very few minutes the carriage moved away and was lost in the crowd of equipages rolling by. At the hottest hours of the hot night, Judith recalled to herself the cool of that day. She brought back the fresh pale greenness of the nook among the bushes into which she had forced her way, the scent of the leaves and the grass which she had drawn in as she breathed, the nearness of the eyes of the bird, and the squirrel, and the child. She smiled as she thought of those things, and as she continued to remember yet other things, bit by bit, she felt less hot. She gradually forgot to listen for the roar of the train. She smiled still more, and she lay quite still. She was cool. A tiny, fresh breeze fluttered through the window and played about her forehead. She was smiling in soft delight as her eyelids drooped and closed. "I'm falling awake," she was murmuring as her lashes touched her cheek. Perhaps when her eyes closed, the sultriness of the night had changed to the momentary freshness of the turning dawn, and the next hour or so was really cooler. She knew no more heat, but kept sleeping softly, deeply, and long. Or it seemed to her afterwards that she had slept long, and if she had drifted far away in a dreamless place. She remembered no dream, and saw nothing, felt nothing until, as it seemed to her, in the early morning she opened her eyes. All was quite still and clear. The air of the room was pure and sweet. There was no sound anywhere, and curiously enough, she was not surprised by this, nor did she expect to hear anything disturbing. She did not look around the room. Her eyes remained resting upon that what she first saw, and she was not surprised by this either. A little girl about her own age was standing smiling at her. She had large eyes, a deep dimple near her mouth, and coppery red hair which fell about her cheeks and shoulders. Judith knew her, and she smiled back at her. She lifted her hand, and it was a pure white little hand with long, superb, tapering nails. "Come play with me," she said, though Judith heard no voice while she knew what she was saying. "Come play with me." Then she was gone. In a few seconds Judith was awake, and the air of the room had changed. The noise and clatter of the streets came in at the windows, and the elevated train went thundering by. Judith did not ask herself how the child had gone or how she had come. She lay still, feeling undisturbed by everything, and smiling as she had smiled in her sleep. While she sat at the breakfast table, she saw her mother looking at her curiously. "You look as though you slept cool instead of hot last night," she said. "You look better than you did yesterday. You're pretty well, ain't you, Judy?" Judith's smile meant that she was quite well, but she said nothing about her sleeping. The heat did not disturb her through the day, and though the hours grew hotter and hotter as they passed, Jane Foster, sweltering at her machine, was obliged to stop every few minutes to wipe the beads from her face and neck. Sometimes she could not remain seated, but got up panting to drink water and fan herself with a newspaper. "I can't stand much more of this," she kept saying. "If there don't come a thunderstorm to cool things off, I don't know what I'll do. This room's about 500. But the heat grew greater, and the elevated trains went thundering by. When Jim came home from his work, his supper was not ready. Jane was sitting helplessly by the window, almost livid in her parlor. The table was but half spread. "Hello," said Jim. "It's done up, ain't it?" "I guess it has," good-natured, certain of his sympathy. "But I'll get it over presently, and then I won't get a cold bite. I'll stand over the stove and cook." "Oh, gee, a cold bite's all a man wants on a night like this. Hot chops just give him Jim Jams. But I've got good news for you. It's cheered me up myself." Jane lifted her head from the chair back. "What is it?" "Well, it came from the boss. He's always been friendly to me. He asks me a question every now and then and seems to take an interest. Today he asked me if I wasn't pretty hot and noisy down here, and after I told him how we stood, he said he believed he could get us a better place to stay through the summer. Someone he knows had an illness and trouble in the family, and he's obliged to close his house and take his wife away to the mountains. They've got a big, beautiful house in one of them far up streets in the park, and he wants to get caretakers that'll come well recommended. The boss said he would recommend us fast enough, but there's a big light basement that's as cool as in the woods, and we can move in tomorrow, and all we've got to do is see that things stay safe and live happy." Oh, Jem! Jane ejaculated. It sounds too good to be true. Up to the park. A big, cool place to live. We've none of us have ever been in a house the size of it. You know what they look like on the outside. They say they're bigger than they look. It's your business to go over the rooms every day and see that nothing's going wrong in them. Moths or dirt, I suppose. It's all left open in just one room they've left locked and don't want it interfered with. I told the boss that I had some basement that would seem like a Waldorf Astoria to us. I tell you, I was glad to scarcely knew what to say. Jane drew a long breath. A big house up there, she said, and only one closed room in it. It's too good to be true. Well, whether it's true or not, we'll move out there tomorrow, Jim answered cheerfully. Tomorrow morning, bright and early. The boss said the sooner the better. The large house, left deserted by those who have filled the rooms with its emotions and life, expresses a silence, a quality of its own. The house, unfurnished and empty, seems like impressively silent. The fact that its devoidness of sound is whole upon the more natural. But carpets accustomed to the pressure of constantly pressing feet, chairs, and sofas which have held human warmth, draperies used to the touch of hands drawing them aside to let the daylight, pictures which have smiled back into thinking eyes, mirrors which have reflected faces passing hourly in changing moods, late and dark and longing, walls which have echoed back voices. All these things, left alone, seem to be held in a strange interest, as if by some spell intensifying the effect of the pause of their existence. The child Judith felt this deeply throughout the entirety of her young being. How still it is, she said to her mother the first time they went over the place together. Well, it all seems still up here, all kind of dead, Jane Foster replied, with her habitual sociable half-laugh. It seems to me it always feels that way in people's left houses. Cheerful enough down to the big old basement with the windows open. We can sit in the room they've fixed to play billiards in. Fish ain't hurt nothing. We can keep the table and things covered up. Tell you, Judy, this will be different from last summer. The park ain't but a few steps away, and we can go and sit there, too, when we feel like it. Talk about the country. I don't want no more country than this. It'll be made over the months we stayed here. Judith felt as if this must veritably be a truth. The houses on either side of the street were closed for the summer. Their occupants had gone to the seaside or to the mountains, and the windows and doors were boarded up. The street was a quiet one at any time, and wore now the aspect of a street to the city of the dead. The green trees of the park were to be seen either gently stirring or motionless in the sun at the side of the avenue crossing the end of it. The only tokens of existence of the elevated railroad was a remote occasional hum suggesting of the flying past of a giant bee. Things seemed no longer a roaring demon, and Judith scarcely recognized that it was still the center of the city's rushing, heated life. The owners of the house had evidently deserted it suddenly. The windows had not been boarded up, and the rooms had been left in their ordinary condition. The furniture was not covered, nor the hangings swathed. Jim Foster had been told that his wife must put these things in order. The house was beautiful and spacious. Its decorations and appointments were not mere testimonies of freedom of expenditure, but expressions of a delighted and cultivated thought. Judith followed her mother from room to room in her singular moods. The loftiness of the walls, the breadth and space about her at intervals, drawing her breath with pleasure. The pictures, the colors, the rich and beautiful texture she saw brought her to free, and at the same time soothing, feeling she remembered in the chief feature of her dreams in which she fell awake. But beyond all other things, she rejoiced in the height and space. She swept the view through one large room into another. She continually paused and stood with her face lifted, looking up at the pictured things floating on the ceiling above her. Welcome in, Oni. Once when she had stood doing this long enough to forget herself, she was startled by her mother's laugh, which broke upon the silence about them with a curious earthly sound, which was almost a shock. Wake up, Judy. Have you gone off in a dream? You look all the time as if you were walking in your sleep. It's so high, said Judy. Those clouds make it look like the sky. I've got to set these chairs straight, said Jane. Looks like they've been having a concert here. All these chairs together and that part of the room clear. She began to move the chairs and rearrange them, bustling about cheerfully and talking a while. And presently she stopped to pick something up. What is this? She said. Then she utterly startled exclamation. Mercy! They felt so calm and clammy they made me jump. They have had a party, and here's some of the flowers falling on the carpet. She held up a cluster of wax-white hyacinths, and large, heavy rosebuds faded to discoloration. This was dropped out of some set piece. It felt like a cold fresh when I touched it. I don't like a lot of white things together. They look too kind of mournful. Just go and get the wastepaper basket in the library, Judy, and we'll carry it around to drop things into. Take that with you. Judith carried the flowers to the library and bent to pick up the basket as she dropped them into it. When she raised her head, she found her eyes looking directly into other eyes, which gazed at her from the wall. They were smiling from the face of a child in the picture. As soon as she saw them, Judith drew in her breath and stood still, smiling, too, in response. The picture was that of a little girl in a floating white frock. She had a deep dimple in the corner of her mouth. Her hanging hair was like burnished copper, and she held up a slender hand with pointed fingers. And Judith knew her at once. Oh, she knew her quite well. She had never felt so near to anyone else throughout her life. Judy! Judy! Jane Foster called out. Come here with your basket. What are you staying for? Judith returned to her. We've got to get a move on, said Jane, or we shan't get nothing done before supper time. What was you looking at? There's a picture of a little girl I know, Judith said. I don't know her name, but I saw her at the park once, and I have dreamed about her. Dreamed about her? If that ain't queer. Well, we've got to hurry up. Here's some more of them dried flowers. Give them the basket. They went through the whole house together, from room to room, up many stairs from floor to floor, and everywhere Judith felt a curious stillness and silence. It cannot be doubted that Jane Foster felt it also. This is the stillest house I ever was in, she said. I'm glad I've got you with me, Judy. If I was so alone, I believe I'd give me the creeps. Big places ought to have big families in them. It was on the 4th floor that they came upon the closed room. Jane had found some of the doors shut and some open, and turning a handle gave entrance to all of the unopened ones until they reached the one that was back on the 4th floor. This one won't open, Jane said as she tried the handle. Then she shook it once or twice. No, it's locked. She decided after an effort or two. There, I've just remembered. There's one kept locked. Folks always has things locked up. I'll make sure, though. She shook it and turned the handle and shook again and pressed her knee against the panel. The lock resisted all effort. Yes, this is a closed one, she made up her mind. It's locked hard and fast, and it's a closed one. It was logically proved to be the closed one by the fact that she found no other one locked as she finished her round about the chambers. Judith was a little tired before they went to their work, and her wandering pilgrimage to that large, silent, deserted house had been a revelation of the new emotion to her. She had always been a silent child. Her mind was so full of strange thoughts that it seemed unnecessary to say many words. The things she thought of as she followed her from room to room, from floor to floor until they reached the locked door, would have amazed and puzzled Jane Foster, if she had known of their existence. Most of all, perhaps, she would have been puzzled by the effect the closed door had upon the child. It puzzled and bewildered Judith and made her feel a little weary. She wanted so much to go into the room. Without the least understanding and feeling, she was quite shaken by it. It seemed as if closing of all the other rooms would have been a small matter in comparison with the closing of this one. There was something inside which she wanted to see. There was something. Somehow there was something which wanted her to see it. What a pity that the door was locked. Why had that been done? She sighed unconsciously several times during the evening, and Jane Foster thought she was just tired. "But you'll sleep cool enough tonight, Judy," she said, "and get a good rest, so them little breezes that come rustling through the trees in the park comes right along the street to us." She and Jim Foster slept well. They spent the evening in the higher spirits as well, as it seemed to them the most luxurious comfort. The space afforded by them in the big basement, with its kitchen and laundry and pantry, and above all, the especially large room which had been used for billiard playing, was actually supplied vistas. For the sake of convenience and coolness, they used the billiard room as a dormitory, sleeping on light cots, and they slept with their windows open, the little breezes wandering from among the trees of the park to fan them. How they laughed and enjoyed themselves over their supper, and how they stretched themselves out on sighs of joy in the darkness as they sank into the cool, untroubled waters of deep sleep. "This is about the top notch," Jim murmured as he lost hold of his world of the waking life and work. But though she was cool, though she was undisturbed, though her body rested in absolute repose, Judith did not sleep for a long time. She lay and listened to the quietness. There was mystery in it. The footstep of a belated passerby on the street woke strange echoes. A voice heard in the distance, a riotous shout suggested weird things. As she lay and listened, it was as if she were not only listening, but wanting for something. She did not know what at all she was waiting for, but waiting she was. She lay upon her cot with her arms flung out and her eyes wide open. What it was that she wanted, that which was in the closed room? Why had they locked the door? If they had locked the doors of the big parlors, it would not have mattered. If they had locked the door of the library? Her mind paused as if for a moment. Something held it still. Then she remembered that to have had all the doors locked in the library would have locked the picture of the child with the greeting look in her eyes and the little uplifted hand. She was glad that the room had been left open. But the room upstairs, the one on the 4th floor, the one that mattered most of all, she knew that tomorrow she must go and stand at the door and press her cheek against the wood and wait and listen. Thinking this, and knowing that it must be so, she fell asleep at last. Part 2. Judith climbed the basement stairs rather slowly. Her mother was busy rearranging the disorder that hastened departing servants had left. The departure had indeed been made in sufficient haste to have left behind the air of its having been a flight. There was a great deal to be done, and Jane Foster, moving about with a broom and pail and scrubbing brushes, did not dislike the excitement of her work before her. Judith's certainty that she would not be missed made all clear before her. If her absence was observed, her mother would realize that the whole house lay open to her, and that she was undisturbing element wherever she had led, whether either by fancy or by circumstance. If she went to the parlors, they would probably sit and talk to herself and play quietly with her shabby doll. In any case, she would be finding pleasure of her own, and would touch nothing which would be harmed. When the child found herself in the entrance hall, she stopped a few moments to look about her. The stillness seemed to hold her, and she paused to hear it. And leaving the basement behind, she had left the movement of the living behind also. No one was alive on this floor, nor upon the next, nor the next. It was as if one had entered a new world, a world in which something existed which did not express itself in sound or in things one could see. Chairs held out their arms to emptiness. Cushions were not pressed by living things. Only the people in the pictures were looking at something, but one could not tell what they were looking at. But on the 4th floor was a closed room, which she must go to, because she must go to it. That was all she knew. She began to mount the stairs which led to the upper floors. Her shabby doll was held against her hip by one arm. Her right hand touched the wall as she went. She felt the height of the wall, and as she looked upward. It was such a large house, and so empty. Where had the people gone, and why had they left it all at once, as if they were afraid? Her father had only heard vaguely that they had gone because they had had trouble. She passed the second floor, the third, and climbed towards the fourth. She could see the door of the closed room as she went up, step by step, and found herself moving more quickly. Yes, she must get to it. She must put her hand on it. Her chest began to rise and fall with a quickening of her breath, and her breath quickened because her heart was fluttering, and as if her heart... She began to be glad, and if anyone could have seen her, they would have been struck by the curious, expectant smile in her eyes. She reached the landing and crossed it, running the last few steps lightly. She did not want to wait or stand still for a moment. With a strange, expectant smile on her lips, as well as in her eyes, she put a hand upon the door. Not upon the handle, but upon the panel. Without any sound, it swung quietly open, and without any sound, she stepped quietly inside. The room was rather large, and the light in it was dim. There were no shutters, and the blinds were drawn down. Judith went to one of the windows and drew up its blind so to look at the place might be clear for her. There were two windows, and they opened on the flat roof of an extension, which suggested somehow that it had been used as a place to walk about on. This, at least, was what Judith thought of at once, that someone had used the room and had been out in the habit of going out upon the roof and staying there as if it had been some sort of garden. There were rows of flower pots with dead flowers in them, and there were green tubs containing large shrubs, which were also dead. Against the low parapet curtain of them held the climbing plants which had been trampled upon. Two had been climbing roses, two were clematis, but Judith did not know them by name. The ledge of the window was so low that it took a mere step to get her outside. So taking it, she stood among the dried, withered things and looked in tender regret at them. "I wish they were not dead," she said softly in the silence. "It would be like a garden if they were not dead." The sun was hot, but a cool little breeze seemed straying up from among the trees of the park. It even made the dried leaves of the flowers tremble and rustle a little. Involuntarily, she lifted her face to the blue sky floating white clouds. They seemed so near that she felt almost as if she could touch them with her hand. The street seemed so far below. The whole world seemed far below. If one stepped off the parapet, one could surely take one long time to reach the earth. She knew now why she'd come up here. It was so that she might feel like this, as if she was upheld far away from things, as if she had left everything behind, almost as if she had fallen awake again. There was no perfume in the air, but it was still sweet and very clear. She suddenly turned and went into the room again, realizing that she had scarcely seen it at all, and that she must see and know it. It was not like any other room she had seen. It looked more simple, though it was a pretty place. The walls were covered with roses, there were bright pictures and shelves full of books. There was also a little writing desk, and there were 2 or 3 low chairs and a low table. The closet in the corner had a storage jar, and Judith could see that inside toys were piled together. In another corner, a large doll's house stood, looking as if someone had just stopped playing with it. Some toy furniture had been taken out and left near it upon the carpet. "It was a little girl's room," Judith said. "Why did they close it?" Her eye was caught with something lying on a sofa, something covered with a cloth. It looked almost like a child lying there asleep, so fast asleep that it did not stir at all. Judith moved across to the sofa and drew the cloth aside. With its head upon a cushion, there was lying a very large doll, dressed beautifully in white lace, its eyes closed and a little wreath of dead flowers in its hair. "It almost looks as if it had died too," said Judith. She did not ask herself why she said, "as if it had died too." Perhaps it was because the place was so still, and everything so far away, and the flowers had died in the strange little deserted garden on the roof. She did not hear any footsteps. In fact, no ghost of a sound stirred in silence when she stood up looking at the doll asleep. But quite quickly she ceased to bend forward and turned around to look at something which she knew was near her. There she was, and it was quite natural she should be there. The little girl with a face like a white flower, with a quantity of burnished coppery hair, and the smile which deepened the already deep dimple near her mouth. "You have come to play with me," she said. "Yes," said Judith. "I wanted to come all night. I could not stay downstairs." "No," said the child. "You can't stay downstairs. Lift up the door." They began to play as if they spent their lives together. Neither asked the other any questions. Judith had not played with other children, but with this one she played in absolute and lovely delight. The little girl knew where all the toys were, and there were a great many beautiful ones. She told Judith where to find them and how to arrange them for their games. She invented wonderful things to do, things which were so unlike anything Judith had seen or heard or thought of that it was not strange that she realized afterwards that all her past life and its belongings had been so forgotten as to wholly blotted out while she was in the closed room. She did not know her playmate's name, and she did not remember that there were such things as names. Every moment was happiness. Every moment the little girl seemed to grow more beautiful, and the flower whiteness of her face and hands, and the strange lightness and freedom of her movements. There was this ecstasy looking at her, a feeling near her. Not long before Judith went downstairs, she found herself standing with her outside the window and among the withered flowers. "It was my garden," the little girl said. "It has been so hot, and no one has been near to water them, so they could not live." She went lightly to one of the brown rose bushes and put her pointed finger little hand quite near it. She did not touch it, but held in her hand near, and the leaves began to stir and unfurl and become fresh and tender again, and the roses were nodding and blooming on the stems. And she went in the same manner to each flower and plant in turn before her dreary little garden was bright and full of leaves and flowers. "It's life," she said to Judith. Judith nodded and smiled back at her, understanding quite well that they had understood the eyes of the bird who had swung on the twig near her cheek that day and had hidden among the bushes of the park. "Now you must go," the little girl said at last, and Judith went out of the room at once, without waiting or looking back, though she knew the white figure did not stir till she was out of her sight. It was not until after she had reached the second floor that the change came upon her. She was a great change and a curious one. The closed room became as far away as the other places and things had seemed when she had stood on the roof feeling the nearness of the blueness and the white clouds, as when she had looked at the roof and found herself face to face with the child in the closed room. She suddenly realized things she had not known before. She knew that she had heard no voice when the little girl spoke to her. She knew that it happened, that it was only she who had lifted the doll, who had taken out the toys, who had arranged the low table for their feast, putting a small service upon it, and though they had played with such rapturous enjoyment and laughed and feasted, what they had feasted on, she could not recall, and not once had she touched or been touched by the light hand or the white tress, and though they seemed to express their own thoughts and intentions freely, she had heard no voice at all. She was suddenly bewildered and stood rubbing her hand over her forehead and her eyes, but she was happy as she had fallen awake in her sleep, and she was no more troubled or really curious than she would have been if she had had the same experience every day in her life. "Well, you must have been having a good time playing upstairs," Jane Foster said when she entered the big kitchen. "This is going to do you good, Judy. It looks like you've had a day in the country, doesn't she, Jim?" Though the weeks had followed, her habit of playing upstairs was accepted as a perfectly normal thing. No questions were asked, and she knew it was not necessary to enter into any explanations. Every day she went to the door of the closed room, and finding it closed, at the touch of her hand upon the panel, it swung open swiftly. There she waited, sometimes for longer times and sometimes for a shorter time, and the child with the coppery hair came to her. The world below was gone as soon as she entered the room, and though the hours they played together joyously as happy children play, but in their playing it was always Judith who touched the toys, who held the doll, who set the little table for their feast. Once she went downstairs, she remembered that when she had done that day, she made a wreath of roses from the roof and had gone to put them on her playmate's head. She had drawn back the deepened dimple, and holding up her hand, she said, laughing, "No, do not touch me." But there was no mystery in it after all. Judith knew she could presently understand. She was so happy that their happiness lived in the face in a sort of delicate brilliance. Jane Foster observed the change in her with exceeding comfort. Her view being that of spacious quarters, fresh air, and sounder sleep had done great things for her. "Them big old eyes of hers ain't like any other child's I've ever seen," she said to her husband with a cheerful self-gratulation. "And her skin's so fine and thin that the air is soft you can just see through her. She always looks to me as if she had been made of different stuff from me and you, Jim. I always said it." "She's going to make a corking handsome girl," responded Jim with a chuckle. They had been in the house for 2 months, when one afternoon, as she was slicing potatoes for supper, Jane looked around to see the child standing in the kitchen doorway, looking with a puzzled expression at some wilted flowers she held in her hand. Jane's impression was that she had been coming into the room and had stopped suddenly to look at what she held. "What have you got there, Judy?" she asked. "They're flowers," said Judith, with her eyes still more puzzled. "Where'd you get 'em from? I didn't know you'd been out. I thought you was upstairs." "I was," Judith said simply, "in the closed room." Jane Foster's knife dropped in her pan with a splash. "Well?" Judith looked at her with quiet eyes. "The closed room?" Jane asked. "What are you saying? You couldn't get in?" "Yes, I can." Jane was conscious of expressing a shock. She said afterwards that she suddenly gave something the creeps. "You couldn't open the door," she persisted. "I tried it again yesterday, and I passed by it, turned the handle, and gave it a regular shove, and it wouldn't move an inch." "Yes," the child answered. "I heard you. We were inside then." A few days later, when Jane weepingly related the incident to awestruck and sympathizing friends, she described as graphically as her limited vocabulary would allow her to do so the look in Judith's face as she came nearer to her. "Don't tell me there was nothing to happen to them," she said. She just came up to me with them dead flowers in her hand and kind of look of eyes that she was half sorry for me, and I didn't quite know why. The door opens for me, she says, and that's where I play every day. There's a little girl comes and plays with me. She comes in at the window, I think. It's like a picture in the room where the books are. Her hair hangs down and she has a dimple near her mouth. I couldn't never tell anyone how I felt like, and it was as if I got super queer frightened that I didn't understand. She must have come from the roof in the next house, I says. They've got an extension too, but I thought the people had gone away. There are flowers on our roof, she said. I got these, and that puzzled look came into her eyes again. They were beautiful when I got them, but when I came downstairs, they died. Well, of all the queer things, I said. She put out her hand and touched the arm in a sort of loving and timid. I wanted to tell you today, Mother, she said. I wanted to tell you, and I don't mind if I go play with her, do you? You don't mind? Perhaps it was because she touched me in that queer little loving way, or was it the way she looked? It seemed like something came over me, and I just grabbed her up and hugged her. No, I says, so you come back, just so you was come back. And to think, and Jane rubbed herself sobbing. A point she dwelt with on many tears that the child seemed in a wistful mood and remained near her side, bringing her a little chair and sitting by her as she worked, and rising to follow her from place to place as she moved from one room to the other. She wasn't never one kiss with you much, and hung you around like some children do. Always used to say she was the least bother of any child I ever knew. Seemed as if she had company of her own when she sat in a little chair in the corner whispering to herself, or just sitting quiet. This was the thing Jane always added during the years in which she had told the stories. That was what made me notice. She kept by me, and she kept looking at me different from any other way I'd seen her look before. Not pitiful exactly, but something like it. And once she came up and kissed me once or twice, and she just kind of touched my hand and my dress and my hand, and I stood by her. She knew. No one needed to tell me she didn't. But this was an error. The child was conscious only of a tender, wistful feeling, which caused her to look at the affectionately healthy young woman who had always been good to her and whom she belonged to, though she remotely wondered why. The same tenderness compelled her to touch her hand and her arm in a simple dress, and folding her arms around her neck to kiss her softly. It was an expression of gratitude for all the rough casual affection of the past. All her life she had spent at her side. All her life on this earth had sprung from her. When she went upstairs to the closed room the next day, she told her mother that she was going before she left the kitchen. "I'm going up to play with a little girl, Mother," she said. "You don't mind, do you?" Jane had had an evening of comfortable domestic gossip and joking with Jim, had slept soundly, and eaten a hearty breakfast. Life was reassured its wholly normal aspect. The sun was shining hot and bright, and she was preparing to scrub the kitchen floor. She believed that the child was mistaken as to the room that she had been in. "That's all right," she said, turning on the hot water spigot over the sink so that the boiling water poured forth at a full flow into a pail, with clouds of steam. "But when I've done scrubbing my scrumming, I'm coming up to see if the closed room is you play in. If it is, I guess you'd better play somewhere else, and I want to find out how you get that door open. Run along if you like." Judith came back to her from the door. "Yes," she said. "Come and see, but if she's there," putting her hand on Jane's hip gently, "you mustn't touch her." Jane turned off the hot water and stared. "Her? The little girl who plays. I never touch her. She says I must not." Jane lifted her pail from the sink, laughing outright. "Well, that sounds like a pretty airy young one," she says. "And I guess you're a little queer little pair. Run on, I must get this floor." Judith ran up the 3 flights of stairs lightly. She was glad that she had told her mother, though she wondered vaguely why it had never seemed right to tell her in the first place. And last night it seemed not so much necessary, but as imperative. Something she had obliged her to tell her. The time had come when she must know. The closed room door had always shut itself gently after Judith passed through it, and yesterday, when Mother, passing by chance, had tried the handle so vigorously the 2 children inside the room had stood still, gazing at each other, but neither had Judith or she spoken about the thought of speaking. She was out of the realm of speech, and without any sense of amazement, was aware that she was out of it. People with voices and words were in that faraway world below. The playing today was even a lovelier, happier thing than it had been before. It seemed to become each minute a thing farther and farther away from the world in the streets where the elevated railroad was humming past like a monster bee. And with a sense of greater distance came a sense of greater lightness and freedom. Judith found that she was moving about the room and the little roof garden almost exactly as she had moved in the waking dreams when she saw Aunt Hester. Almost as if she was floating, and every moment was ecstasy. Once as she thought this, she looked at her playmate. The child smiled and answered her as she always did before as she spoke. "Yes," she said. "I know her. She will come. She sent me." She had this day a special plan with regard to arranging the closed room. She wanted all the things in it, the doll, the chairs, the toys, the little table, and its service to be placed in certain positions. She told Judith what to do. Various toys were put here and there. The little table was set with certain dishes in a very particular part of the room. The book was left lying upon the sofa cushions. The large doll was put in a chair near the sofa, with the smaller doll in its arms. And on the little writing desk a letter, which Judith found in the drawer. A half-written letter was laid. The pen was left in the ink. It was a strange game to play, but somehow Judith felt it wasn't very pretty. When it was all done, and there were many curious things to do, the closed room looked quite different from the cold, dim, orderly place the first floor had been when it had opened. Then it looked as if everything had been swept up and sent away and covered and done with forever, as if the life of it had ended and would never begin again. Now it looked as if some child who had lived in it and played and loved with each of its belongings had just stepped out from her play to some other room quite near. Quite near. The big doll in its chair seemed waiting, even listening to her voice as it came from the room she had run into. The child with the burnished hair stood and looked at it with all her delicious smile. "This is how it looked," she said. "They came and hid everything, as if I'd gone, as if I was nowhere. I want her to come and see you. I couldn't do it myself. You could do it for me. Go and bring some roses." The little garden was a wonder of strange beauty with masses of flowers. Judith brought some roses from the bush, and her playmate pointed out. She put them in a light bowl and was like a bubble thin, clear glass, and stood on the desk near the letter. "They would like the look of that," she said. "She would see, but no one seems like that. Then the life goes away with me." After the game was finished, they went out on the roof garden and stood and looked up into the blue clouds above their head. How blue, how clear, how near and real. How far and unreal the streets and sounds were below. The two children stood and looked up and laughed at the sweetness of it. Then Judith felt a little tired. "I'll go lie down on the sofa," she said. "Yes," the little girl answered. "It's time for you to go to sleep." They went into the closed room, and Judith lay down. As she did so, she saw that the door was standing open, and remembered that her mother was coming up to see her and her playmate. The little girl sat down by her, and put out her pretty fine hand and touched Judith for the first time. She laid her little pointed fingers on her forehead, and Judith fell asleep. It seemed only a few moments before she awakened again, the little girl standing beside her. She said. They went out together onto the roof among the flowers, but a strange, beautiful thing had happened. The garden did not end at the parapet, and the streets and the houses were not below. The little garden ended in a broad green pathway, green with thick, soft grass and moss covered with trembling white and bluebell-like flowers. Trees, fresh leaves as if spring had just awakened them, shaded it and made it look like a smiling fair. Great white blossoms tossed on their branches, and Judith felt the scent of the air came from them. She forgot the city was below, because it was millions and millions of miles away, and this was where it was right to be. There was no mistake. This was real. The rest was unreal, and millions of miles away. She held the other's slim pointed hand and stepped out upon the fresh green pathway. There was no boundary or end to its beauty, and it was only another real thing that coming towards him from under the white flowering trees was Aunt Hester. In the basement, Jane Foster had absorbed into labors which were those accustomedness provided with her pleasure. She was fond of her scrubbing, and she enjoyed the washing of her dishes, and definitely entertained herself with a splash of soapy foam with the wash tubs, and the hearty smack and swing of her ironing. In the days when she had served at the ribbon counter at the department store, she had found life as agreeable as she had ever found it in the hours which were spent apart from her own private sewing machine, and were given to hearty domestic duties, providing cleanliness, savory meals, and comfort for Jim. She was so busy this particular afternoon that it was inevitable that she should forget all else but the work which kept her on her knees scrubbing floors, or on chairs polishing windows, and afterwards hanging before them bits of clean spotted muslin. She was doing this last when her attention being distracted by the wheels in the street stopping before the door. She looked out of the carriage door, and a young woman, dressed in exceptionally deep mourning garb, stepped onto the pavement, crossed it, and ascended the front steps. "Who is she?" Jane exclaimed disturbedly. "Does she think the house is let because it's shut?" A ring at the doorbell called her down from her chair. Among the duties of the caretakers naturally included that of answering and questioning of visitors. She turned down her sleeves and put on a fresh apron and ran upstairs to the entrance hall. When she opened the door, a tall young woman in black stepped inside as if there were no reason for her remaining even a moment on the threshold. Mrs. Walden," she said. "I suppose you're the caretaker?" Holden was the name of the people to whom the house belonged. Jim Foster had only heard the vaguest things of them, and Jane remembered that the name was Holden, and remembered that they had gone away because they had had some trouble, and recognized at a glance what sort of trouble it had been. Mrs. Holden was tall and young, and to Jane Foster's mind expressed from head to foot the perfection of all that spoke of wealth and fashion. Her garments were heavy and rich with crepe. The long black veil, which she held thrown back, swept over her shoulder and hung behind her, serving to set forth, as it were, more pitiful the white wornness of her pretty face, and a sort of haunting eagerness of her haggard lips. She had been a smart, lovely, laughing, and lovable thing, full of pleasure in the world. Now she was as stricken and devastated that she seemed to set apart the awful loneliness world of her own. She had no sooner crossed the threshold than she looked about her with a quick, smitten glance and began to tremble. Jen saw her look shudder away from the open door of the front room, where the chairs had seemed left as if something had been gathered, and the white wax flowers that had scattered on the floor. She fell into a curved hall seat and dropped her face into her hands, her elbows resting on her knees. "Oh, no, no," she cried. "I can't believe it, I can't believe it." Jane Foster's eyes filled with good-natured, ready tears of sympathy. "Won't you come upstairs, ma'am?" she said. "Wouldn't you like to sit in your own room, perhaps?" "No, no," she said. "She was always there. She used to come into my bed in the morning. We used to watch me dress to go out. No, no." "I'll open the shutters of the library," said Jane. "Oh, no, no, no. She would be sitting on the big sofa of her fairy storybook. She's everywhere, everywhere. How could I come? Why did I? But I couldn't keep away. I tried to stay in the mountains, but I couldn't. Something dragged me day and night. Nobody knows I'm here." She got up and looked about her again. "I've never been in here since I went out with her," she said. "They would not let me come back. They said it would kill me. And now I've come, and everything is here, and all the things we lived with. She has millions and millions, millions of miles away." "Oh, who was it?" Jane asked timidly in a low voice. "It was my little girl," the poor young beauty said. "It was my little Andrea. Her portrait is in the library." Jane began to tremble somewhat herself. "That," she began and ended. "She is dead." Mrs. Holden had dragged herself almost as if unconscious onto the stairs. She leaned against the newel post and her face dropped upon her hand. "Oh, I didn't know," she said. "I can't believe it. How could she be? She was playing in the nursery, laughing and playing. She ran into the next room to show me a flower. She looked up at me laughing, and tell you laughing, she sank down slowly to her knees. The flower fell out of her hand quietly, and everything went out of her face." "Everything was gone away from her, and there was never anything more. Never." Well, we got ready, eh, Michael? I am doing dramatic reading, clearly. Jane Foster's hand had crept up to her throat. She did not know what made her cold. "My little girl," she began. "Her name is Judith." "Where is she?" said Mrs. Holden in a breathless way. "She is upstairs," Jane answered slowly. "She goes into that back room on the 4th floor." Mrs. Holden turned upon her with wide eyes. "It is locked," she said. "They put everything away. I have the key." "The door opens for her," said Jane. "She goes to play with a little girl who comes to her. I think she comes over the roof from the next house." "There is no child there!" Miss Holden shuddered, but it was not with horror. It was actually with a wild, drawing bliss on her face. "What is she like?" "She's like the picture." Jane scarcely knew her own monotonous voice. The world of real things was being withdrawn from her, and she was standing in without the pale, alone with this woman with wild eyes. She began to shiver because her warm blood was growing cold. "She's a child with red hair, and there's a dimple near her mouth. Judith told me you must not touch her." She heard a wild gasp, a flash of something at once anguish and rapture blazed across the haggard young face, and with a swerving as if her slight body had been swept round by a sudden great wind, Mrs. Hodgson turned and fled up the stairs. Jane Foster followed. The great wind swept her upward, too. She remembered no single intake or outtake of breath until she was on the 4th floor. The door of the closed room stood wide open. Mrs. Hodgson was swept inside. Jane Foster saw her stand in the middle of the room for a second, a small, tall, swaying figure. She whirled about her and flung up her arms with an unearthly, rapturous cry. "That is all that's left as she ran to me and fell. She has been here too. She showed me where, and it's not too far." She sank slowly upon her knees, wild happiness in her face, wild tears pouring down. "She has seen her," she said with outstretched arm, yearning towards the little figure of Judith, who lay quiet upon the sofa in the corner. "Your little girl has seen her, and I dare not awaken her. She is asleep." Jane stood by the sofa, looking down. When she bent and touched the girl, and the stillness of the room seemed to have got quite into her blood. "No," she said, quivering with a strange simplicity. "No, not asleep. It was this way with her Aunt Hester." "Okay then. Kids, don't play with dead things." Well, that was creepy. That is definitely going in my Halloween stream. Let's see, did the shadow? Yeah, killed in the shadow. Good. So, welcome in, Raiders. I hope you liked the end of the story. And I'm hoping my audio didn't screw up at any time during that. Because from what I'm hearing, it should be sounding okay. Sorry I did not catch the ads in time to pause them. And the wild chingling is in chat. Yes, thank you for the bits, Oni. I'm a little slow on seeing that too. That was... I liked making the voice of the ghost child. Okay, that was a particularly long story. The next one is only 12 pages. Thank you for lurking, Oni. Okay, I'm going to try to do one more story. And it is a fairly familiar author, James Matthew Barrie. But it's a story from 1906. Again, written by J.M. Barrie. Called Lockout Time. And so, for my editing later, Lockout Time. It is frightfully difficult to know much about the fairies, and almost the only thing known for certain is that there are fairies wherever there are children. Long ago, children were forbidden in the gardens, and that at the time there was not a fairy in the place. But then children were admitted, and the fairies came trooping in that very evening. They can't resist following the children, but you seldom see them, partly because they live in the daytime behind the railings, where you are not allowed to go. And also partly because they're so cunning. They're not a bit cunning after lockout, but until lockout, my word. When you were a bird, you knew the fairies pretty well, and you remember a good deal about them from your babyhood. Which is a pity that you can't write down, for gradually you forget. And I've heard the children who declared that they had once never seen a fairy. Very likely, if they said that in Kensington Garden, they were standing looking at a fairy at the time. The reason they were cheated was that they pretended to be something else. This is one of their best tricks. They usually pretend to be flowers, because the court sits in the fairy's basin. And there are so many flowers there that, along the baby walk, that a flower is the thing least likely to attract attention. They dress exactly like flowers and change into the seasons, putting on white, then lilies are in, and blue for the bluebells, and so on. They like crocus and hyacinthus best of all. They are partially bit to the color, but tulips, exceptionally white ones, which are the fairy cradles, they consider garish. And they sometimes put off dressing like tulips for days, so that the beginning of the tulip weeks is almost the best time to catch them. When they think you are not looking, they skip along pretty lively, but if you look and they fear there's no time to hide, they stand quite still, pretending to be flowers. Then, after you've passed without knowing that they were fairies, they rush home and tell their mothers that they had such an adventure. The fairy basin, you remember, is all covered with ground ivy, from which they make their castor oil, with flowers growing in it there and here and there. Most of them really are flowers, but some of them are fairies. You never know until you can be sure of them, but a good plan is to walk by looking the other way, then turn around sharply. Another good plan, which David and I sometimes follow, is to stare them down. After a long time they can't help winking, and then you know for certain that they are fairies. There are also numbers of them along the Baby Walk, which is a famous gentle place the spots frequented by fairies are called. Once 24 of them had an extraordinary adventure. There was a girls go out for a walk with her governess, and all wearing hyacinthus gowns, where suddenly they put a finger to their mouth, and then they all stood in an open bed and pretended to be hyacinthus. Unfortunately, what the governess had heard was two gardeners coming to plant new flowers in that very bed. They were wheeling a handcart with the flowers in it, and were quite surprised to find the bed occupied. "Pity to lift them, hyacinthus," said one man. "Duke's orders," replied the other. Having emptied the cart, they dug up the boarding school, put them in the poor, terrified things, and put it in 5 rows. Of course, neither the governesses nor the girls dare let on that they were fairies, so they were carried far away to a potting shed, out of which they escaped the night without their shoes. But there was a great row about it in the morning, and the school was ruined. As for their houses, it is no use looking for them, because they are the exact opposite of our houses. You can see our houses by day, but you can't see them by dark. Well, you can see their houses by dark, but you can't see them in the day, for they are the color of night. I never heard of anyone yet who could see the night in the daytime. This does not mean that they are black, for night has its own colors just as day does, and ever so much more brighter. The blues and reds and greens are like ours, with a light behind them. The palace is entirely built of many-colored glasses, and is quite loveliest of all royal residences, but the queen sometimes complains because the common people will peep in to see what she is doing. They are very inquisitive folk and press quite hard against the glass, and that is why their noses are mostly stubby. The streets are miles long and very twisty, and have paths to each side made like worsened. The birds used to steal the worsted of their nests, but the policeman has been appointed to hold on the other end. One of the great differences between fairies and us is they never do anything useful. When the first baby laughed for the first time, his laugh broke into 1,000,000 pieces and they went skipping about. That was the beginning of fairies. They look tremendously busy, you know, as if they had not a moment to spare. But if you were to ask them what they were doing, they could not tell you in the least. They're frightfully ignorant, and everything they do is make-believe. They have a postman, but he never calls except at Christmas with his little box. And though they have beautiful schools, nothing is taught them. The youngest child, being chief person, is always the naked mistress, and when she called the roll, they all go out for a walk, and they never come back. It is a very noticeable thing that, in fairy families, that the youngest is always the chief person, and usually becomes a prince or princess, and children remember this. and they think it is so among humans also, and that is why they often make uneasy when they come upon their mothers furtive putting new frills on the bassinets. You've probably observed that your baby's sister wants to do all sorts of things that your mother and her nurse want not her to do. To stand up at sitting down time, and to sit down at standing up time, for instance, or to wake up when she should fall asleep, or to crawl on the floor when she's wearing her best frock, and so on. And perhaps you put this down to naughtiness, but it is not. It simply means that she is doing what she has seen the fairies do. She begins by following their ways, and it takes about 2 years to get her into the human ways. Her fits of passion, which are awful to behold, are usually called teething, and there are no such thing. They're her natural exasperation because she won't understand her, though she is talking a very intelligible language. She's talking fairy. The reason mothers and nurses know what her remarks mean before other people know is that gutch means give it to me at once, while wah is why do you wear such funny hats? As because mixing of such things with babies, they have picked up a little of the fairy language. Of late, David has been thinking back hard of the fairy tongue, with his hands clutching his temples, and he has remembered a number of their phrases, which I shall tell you someday if I don't forget. He had heard them in the days when he was thrush, and though I suggested to him that perhaps he really is a little bird, he is remembering the language, he says not, for these phrases are about fun and adventures, and birds talked of nothing but nest building. He distinctly remembers that birds used to go from one spot to another like ladies at window shopping, looking for different nests and saying, "Not my color, my dear," and "How would that do with a soft lining?" and "But will it wear?" and "What hideous trimming?" and so on. The fairies are exquisite dancers, and that is why the first things a baby does is to sign to you to dance to him, and then to cry when you do not do it. They hold their great balls in the open air, and this is what's called a fairy ring. For weeks afterwards you can see the ring on the grass. It is not where the ring began, but where they make it waltzing around and around. Sometimes you will find mushrooms inside the ring, and these are fairy chairs that the servants have forgotten to clear away. The chairs and the rings are only telltale marks that these little people leave behind. They would remove even these were they not so fond of dancing that they tow it to the very last moments of opening the gates. David and I once found a fairy ring quite warm. But there is also a way of finding out the ball before it takes place. You know the boards which tell at what time the gardens are to close today? Well, these tricky fairies sometimes slightly change the board on the ball night, so that it says the gardens are to close at 6:30, for instance, instead of at 7. This enables them to get begun half an hour earlier. On such a night we could remain behind in the gardens, as the famous Mammy Mariner did, and we see such delights. Hundreds of lovely fairies hastening to the ball, the married ones wearing their wedding rings around their waists, and the gentlemen, all in uniform, holding up the ladies' trains, and linkmen running in front carrying winter cherries, which are like fairy lanterns. The cloakroom where they put all their silver slippers and get a ticket for their wraps, the flowers streaming in the baby walk, and so on. It looks welcome because they can lend a pen at the supper table, with Queen Mab at the head of it, and behind her chair the Lord Chamberlain, who carries a dandelion on it which he blows when Her Majesty wants to know the time. The tablecloth varies according to the seasons, and in May it may be made of chestnut blossom. The ways of the fairy servants do is this. The men, scores of them, climb the trees and shake the branches, and the blossoms fall like snow. And then the lady servants sweep it together, whisking them with their skirts until they look exactly like a tablecloth. And that is how they make their tablecloth. They have real glasses and real wine of 3 kinds, namely blackthorn wine, Barrire's wine, and cowslip wine, and the queen pours out, but the bottles are so heavy that she just pretends to pour out. There's bread and butter to begin with, about the size of a 3-penny bit, and cakes to end with, and they're so small that they have no crumbs. The fairies sit around on their mushrooms, and at first they're very well behaved and always cough off the table, and so on, but after a bit they're not so well behaved, and stick their fingers into the butter, which has got to the roots of the old trees, and really horrid ones crawl over the tablecloth, chasing sugar and other delicacies with their tongues. When the queen sees them doing this, she signs to the servants to wash up and put away. Then everybody adjourns to the dance. The queen walking in front while Lord Chamberlain walks behind her, carrying two little pots, one of which contains the juice of wallflower, and the other contains the juice of Solomon's seals. Wallflower juice is good for relieving dancers who fall to the ground in a fit. Solomon's seal juice is for bruises. They bruise very easily, and when Peter plays faster and faster, they foot it still done in fits. For, you all know without my telling you, Peter Pan is the fairies' orchestra. He sits in the middle of the ring, and they would never dream of having a smart dance nowadays without him. P.P. is written on the corner of the invitation card sent out by all really good families. They're grateful little people, too, and the princess's coming-of-age ball, they come of age on their second birthday and have a birthday every month, they gave him the wish of his heart. The way it was done is this. The queen ordered him to kneel, and then said that for playing beautifully, she would give him the wish of his heart. Then they all gathered round Peter to hear what the wish of his heart was, but for a long time he hesitated, not being certain what it was himself. "If I chose to go back to Mother," he asked at last, "would you give me that wish?" Now this question vexed him, for were he returned to his mother, they would lose his music, and the queen tilted her nose contemptuously and said, "Pooh, ask for a bigger wish than that." "That is quite a little wish," he answered. "As little as this," the queen answered, putting her hand near each other. "What size is a big wish?" he asked. She measured it off. On her skirt, and it was a very handsome length. Then Peter reflected and said, "Well then, I think I shall have two little wishes instead of a big one." Of course, the fairies had to agree, though his cleverness rather shocked them, and he said that his first wish was to go to his mother, but with the right to return to the gardens if he found her disappointing. His second wish was one he would hold in reserve. They tried to dissuade him, but even put obstacles in his way. "I can give you the power to fly to our house," the queen said, "but can't open the door for you." "The window I flew out of will be open," said Peter confidently. "Mother always keeps it open and hope that I will fly back." "How do you know?" they asked, quite surprisingly, and really Peter could not explain how he knew. "I just do," he said. As he persisted in this wish, they had granted it, and they gave him power to fly was this. They all tickled him on the shoulder, and soon he felt a funny itching in that part. Then he rose higher and higher and flew away out of the gardens and over the housetops. It was so delicious that instead of flying straight to his old home, he skimmed away to St. Paul's, to the Crystal Palace, and back by the river in Regent's Park. By the time he reached his mother's window, he had quite made up his mind that his second wish should become a bird. The window was wide open, just as he knew it would be, and then he fluttered. And there was his mother lying asleep. Peter alighted softly to the wooden rail at the end of the bed, and had a good look at her. She lay with her head on her hand, and the hollow of the pillow like a nest lined with her brown wavy hair. He remembered, though he had long forgotten it, that he had always gave her hair a holiday at night. How sweet the frills of her nightgown were. He was very glad she was such a pretty mother. But she looked sad, and he knew why she looked sad. One of her arms moved as one to go around and round something, but he knew what it was wanted to go around. "Oh, Mother," said Peter to himself, "if you just knew who was sitting on the rail at the foot of the bed." Very gently he patted the little mound he made at her feet, so he could see her by the face that she liked it. He knew he had, by the way, to say "Mother" ever softly, she would wake up. Then always wake up at once if you say their name. Then she would give such a joyous cry and squeeze him tight. How nice that would be for him, but oh, how exquisitely delicious it would be for her. I'm afraid that is how Peter regarded it. And returning to his mother, he never doubted that he was giving her the greatest treat as a woman can have. Nothing can ever be more splendid, he thought, than to have a little boy of your own. How proud of him they are, how very right and proper, too. But why does Peter sit so long on the rail? Why does he not tell his mother that he's come back? I quite shrink from the truth, which is that he sat there for 2 minds. Sometimes he looked longingly at his mother, and sometimes he looked longingly at the window. Certainly it would be a pleasure to be her boy again, but on the other hand, what times those had been in the gardens! He was sure that he would enjoy wearing clothing again. He popped off the bed and opened some drawers to have a look at his old garments. They were still there, but he could not remember how to put them on. Socks, for instance, they were worn by the hands or on the feet. He was about to try them on one of each hand, and then he had a great adventure. Perhaps the drawer had creaked. At any rate, his mother woke up, and he heard her turn to say, "Peter," as if it was the most lovely word in the language. He remained sitting on the floor and held his breath, wondering how she knew that he had come back. If she had said Peter again, he meant to cry "Mother" and run to her. But she spoke no more, and she only made little moans. And then he peeped at her. She was once more asleep, with tears on her face. It made Peter very miserable, and what do you think the first thing he did? Sitting on the rail at the foot of the bed, he played a beautiful lullaby to his mother on his pipe. He had made it up himself, out of the way she said Peter, and he never stopped playing until she looked happy. He thought this so clever of him that he scarcely resisted waking her to hear her say, "Oh, Peter, how wonderfully you play." However, she was not seem comfortable, and he cast looks in the window again. You must not think that he meditated flying away and never coming back. He had quite decided to be his mother's boy, but hesitated to bring him tonight. There was a second wish which troubled him. He no longer meant to make it to be a wish to be a bird, but not to ask for a second wish seemed wasteful, and of course, he could not ask for it without returning to the fairies. Also, if he put off asking his wish too long, it might go bad. He asked himself if he had not been hard-headed with the way he had flown away that night to goodbye to Solomon. "I should be awful to sail in my boat just once more," he said wistfully to his sleeping mother. He quite argued with her as if she could hear him. "It would be splendid to tell the birds of this adventure," he said coaxingly. "I promise to come back." And she said solemnly, and he meant it too. And in the end, he flew away. Twice he came back to the window, wanted to kiss his mother, but he feared the delight of it waking her. So at last he played her a lovely kiss on his pipe, and then flew back to the gardens. Many nights and even months passed before he asked the fairies for a second wish, and I am not sure that I quite know what he delayed so long. For one reason was that he had said so many goodbyes to say, not only his particular friends, but to 100 of his favorite spots. Then he had his last sail, and his very last sail, and his last sail of all, and so on. Again, a number of farewell feasts were given in his honor, and another comfortable reason was that, after all, there was no hurry, for his mother was never weary of waiting for him. The last reason displeased old Solomon, for it was an encouragement to the birds to procrastinate. Solomon had several excellent mottos in keeping them at their work, such as, "Never put off lying today, because you can lay tomorrow," and "In the world there is no second chances." And yet, here was Peter, gaily putting off, and none the worse for it. The birds pointed this out to each other, and fell into lazy habits. But, mind you, though Peter was slow to going back to his mother, he was quite decided to go back. The best proof of this was his caution with the fairies. They were most anxious that he should remain in the gardens and play for them. And to bring this to pass, they tried to trick him into making such a remark as, "I wish the grass was not so wet." And some of them danced about in high hopes that he might cry, "I wish he would keep time." Then they would have said that this was a second wish. But he smoked their design, and through the occasions he began, "I wish," he always stopped in time. So when at last he was said to them bravely, "I wish to go back to my mother forever and always," they had to tickle his shoulders and let him go. He went in a hurry to the end because he had dreamt that his mother was crying, and he knew that there was a great thing she cried for, and that her hug was her splendid Peter would quickly make her smile. Oh, he felt sure of it, and he was so eager as he was, nestling in her arms. At this time, he flew straight to her window, which was always to be open for him. But the window was closed, and there were iron bars on it. Peering inside, he saw his mother sleeping peacefully with her arm around another little boy. Peter called, "Mother! Mother!" But she heard him not. In vain he beat his little limbs on the iron bars. He had to fly back, sobbing, to the gardens, and he was never to see his dear again. What a glorious boy he had meant to be to her. Ah, Peter, who were made the great mistake. How differently we should all act in the second chance. But Solomon was right. There is no second chance. Not for most of us. When we reach the window, it is lockout time, and the iron bars are up for life. Okay, well, that had lots of clippable lines in it. And it is only 10:30. 10:36. Everyone, they got 2 more stories in this book that are public domain. One of them is almost 20 pages long, so I'm not sure I'd be able to get through that tonight. So I wonder if anyone's on we can raid. Let's have a look, shall we? Lockout Time wasn't really a dark fairy tale, other than the fact the fairies were trying to keep Peter behind. Which is interesting that it turned into a Peter Pan story. Ugh. Does anyone, by chance, have any raid suggestions? Because I am drawing a complete blank. And I don't seem to be all here. Let's see. Anyone doing reading fun right now? I see. When did they start? What is Robo Edit? Because I've got no viewers. I'm going to peek in their stream real quick. Oh no. Oh no. Live streams featuring a real-time digitization of books? What? I've only got 10 followers, but it's kind of a creepy notion. And they haven't started streaming yet. They've got like a, kind of like me, a 10-minute countdown before they start doing anything. That's... I don't know. That's... There's one other person but they're reading the Baldur's Gate book. Course, doesn't look like any of my friends are on. Huh. I don't know. I may just not raid. In which case, I guess I will tell you all good night and switch to my ending stream and see if you guys can actually hear my vocalizations.
Don't forget.
Otherwise, have a good night and pleasant dreams.
Tuck you in, warm within, keep you free from sin, till the Sandman he comes. Sleep with one eye open, gripping your pillow tight. Exit light, enter night.